Okay, so hello everyone, and thank you for being here. My name is Paul D'Ambrosio, and I teach Chinese philosophy at East China Normal University, where the四海为学Collaborative Learning Project is based. I want to welcome you to our first event of 2026, which is our 33rd lecture and our 68th event since 2022. Today, we are hosting Professor Louise Edwards, who will be giving a talk on childhood and infancy in China, with a special emphasis, I believe, on gender issues. Joining us as invited discussants for this talk are Professor Sarah Rodriguez from Emory University and Professor Ping Zhu from University California, San Diego. Our chair today seems to be running a little bit late, but I'll introduce her if she does come later. It would be Professor Dimitra Amarantidou from Shandong University. It has become a tradition here at四海为学to give younger scholars a chance to be part of high-profile academic events by inviting them to take part as chairs or discussants. So if there are any younger scholars in the audience today who wish to be part of future events, please email me. This event will be 90 minutes total, ending promptly at 10:30 a.m. Beijing time. Before getting things started and handing them over to Professor Dimitra, or just doing it myself, I want to say a couple of things about the 四海为学Collaborative Learning Academic Forum. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project hopes to distinguish itself from some of the less productive conventional practices sometimes found in contemporary academia. As posted on our website, we are not interested in male peacocks, in jerks, or in any form of egoism or self-promotion. We hope to curb all types of aggressive and "look at me, I'm smarter than you," or "don't I know so much," and similar attitudes sometimes found in academic exchanges. We might even go so far as to say that we hope to be a counterbalance for the negative attitudes often found in so-called blind reviews. While there is certainly a time and a place for anonymity, or at least the appearance of anonymity, communication in academia should have just as much time and place for speaking to one another on more congenial and community-forming settings. The neologism 四海为学, which was created by Robin Wong, is of course a play on 四海为家, and we hope to keep this idea of 四海为家at the foreground of all of our events. The 四海为学 Collaborative Learning Project seeks to accomplish these shifts in orientation during academic exchange by encouraging productive communication, humble discussions, real questions, and responses that are open and honest. We hope to foster environments where people truly learn from and with one another. So I want to once again thank everyone for being here, particularly the invited guests for taking time and sharing with us. Our speaker today is Professor Louise Edwards. Professor Edwards, sorry, I think I didn't get your bio actually.
Oh, okay. I'll check the email outbox.
Oh, sorry. Here.
Maybe
Sorry. No. I just got it. I got Sarah's and I got confused. Sorry about that. Okay. Professor Louise Edwards is Emeritus Professor of Chinese History at UNSW Sydney. She is also Honorary Professor at the University of Hong Kong School of Modern Languages and Cultures and the University of Technology of Sydney's Australian China Research Institute, and a senior advisor to Asia Link at Melbourne University. In 2022, she was appointed chair of the board to the ANU's China in the World Center. The talk today draws on her 2025 article in Modern China, available on open access. Her most recent sole-authored books include Citizens of Beauty, Drawing Democratic Dreams in Republican China, Women Warriors and Wartime Spies of China, and Women, Politics and Democracy, Women's Suffrage in China. Professor Edwards is also a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, and the Hong Kong Academy of Humanities. Thank you very much, Professor Edwards, for being with us again. And I can honestly say that I'm very much looking forward to your talk, and I know a lot of other people are as well. So thank you.
Shall I start now then? Go for it. Okay. Well, I'd like to really thank Paul and for inviting me, and for Sarah and Ping for agreeing to discuss this with me. It's a very sort of open-ended topic. It's not like a very specific cutting edge, detailed bit of research. So I'm hoping that it's open enough to generate really broad discussion. And as Paul said, it's based on an article that I did for Modern China. But the reason I did the article was because the editor, Catherine Bernhardt, was wanted to celebrate 50 years of the journal's existence. And so she wanted to have something on gender in there. And she said to me, well, where's the future of gender going? And can you write something about this, gender in China studies? And I thought really hard, and because I think a lot of the response to that kind of question was, well, let's do a state of the field study and then see what's there, And then when I started looking at the state of the field, I realized gender in China studies is huge, just in the English language, material. Like I was only charged with doing the English language stuff. So, it was like, oh my goodness, the more I looked, the more I saw how huge our field was. And this was like a cause for celebration, but it also meant that unless you were going to write a whole book like Robin Yates and Danny Tai have done, on the bibliography, then you're going to miss a whole lot of stuff. It was just going to be too big a task and not really productive. So I thought, okay, let's choose a bit that I think needs some pushing along. Choose a topic that needs pushing along. Even though I myself am not an expert in childhood or infancy, I just felt like the people that are working in this field needed to be showcased, and they needed sort of some encouragement to keep doing the work, because it's such a really important part of the human experience. And then the other aspect that I thought was really interesting when Catherine asked me to do it was, I sort of looked back at my own career, and I remember really distinctly in 2000 talking to a publisher about the book that I was trying to get published at that time on women's suffrage in China. And she just turned around, it was a major university press, and she turned around and she said, gender is dead. Nobody's teaching in gender. Nobody's publishing in gender. You're still relatively young. Why don't you switch your topic and do something that will be better for your career? And I was shocked. I was really shocked, because it didn't seem to me that gender was dead. And then I sort of thought, you know what? I'm not going to change. I'm doing this not just for my career. I'm doing this because it's meaningful in my life. It's meaningful to the people I see around me, and so I just stuck to it. And then, however many decades later, we're looking at a field that is so huge. Gender has impacted every single aspect of the humanities and social sciences. It's even impacted fields that maybe had thought themselves immune to it, like the sciences and engineering. It's architecture. It's everywhere. It's been such a powerful driver of new ideas around the world that I think there's a really good cause to celebrate what we've done. And in the case of China studies, I think at this point, I really think it's important for us to remember that when gender and China was basically called women's studies in the 70s and 80s, before it sort of became more gender broader and broadened to gender, women's studies was totally transformed by the ideas coming out of China. And so women scholars of China were at the forefront of reshaping how the whole world analyzed gender. We hear often about how the West makes the theory, and then China or Thailand or Cambodia will then add their case study to tweak the theory or propose a model or show how it's different. But the drive and the energy comes from Euro-American models. In the case of gender and women's studies, this was not not the experience. People working on China were at the forefront of shaping the very foundations of women's studies in the 1970s. And this was partly because of the enthusiasm for that Maoist Iron Woman. There were such different models coming out of China for how men and women could interact that you couldn't just say, oh, this was a small case study that will not really impact the foundations of our field. And so I want to say that here now, because in the crazy world that we're living in, we have a situation where what Gayatri Spivak had said way back in '88, I think it was, that, white men were supposedly saving brown women from brown men. And we see this happening all around the world in the justification for wars that we are currently witnessing on our TV shows. So I think it's really important on our TV news. I think it's really important for the experience of Chinese women to be told very, very clearly all around our global media, all around our public discourse, because while it may be surprising to people in China to hear, the stories of the suffering, abject, oppressed Chinese women still has currency in political discourse among Western media. They still think, oh, we've got to go and save Chinese women from, XYZ oppression. And this is a very powerful thread that runs through a lot of public discourse. And I think it's really important for Chinese women's voices and Chinese women's experiences, and also just gendered experiences generally from Chinese men as well, to be more publicly available so that lies can't be told, stories can't be constructed that aren't based on anything other than, say, greed or avarice or just sheer violence. So anyway, so why should we focus on infancy and childhood in connection to gender? Well, I think that, there's a strong amount of research that focuses on education. There's been quite a bit of work that looks at how boys and girls are gendered by the school curriculum. And there's also been a lot of work on health in the medical field, on maternal and child health, on infants in particular. But when we combine infancy and childhood with gender, there's not very much happening outside of that. How do infants and children and the lifelong experience of all humans of being a child, because we're all someone's child, how is that a gendered experience? How is that gendering through each stage of the life course? The experience of being a child, the experience of being around infants and children. And I think one of the reasons it hasn't really had the full gender lens kind of attack is because gender and sexuality are commonly seen as most relevant when a human hits puberty, that's when the real gendering starts taking place. And Xiong Bingjin, back in the 2000s, early 2000s, when she did her book on the history of childhood and the imperial era, she noted that prior to the age of 7, it was largely seen as an asexual arena. Kids were kids. They weren't, necessarily gendered as very strongly. But she and other pioneers in the field, like Anne Barrett Wicks and Anne Benke-Kinney, they kept encouraging us to look at gender and childhood. And there was sort of like not much done, considering the boom in the other areas of gender. Not much was happening in terms of this nexus between infancy and gender and childhood and gender. 20 years later, so up to about now, we see works by Orna Naftali, Margaret Tillman, and Jing Xu, but there's really a gap of 20 years when, leaves us with many more angles to explore. So I think partly there's a really low value placed on children and childhood and the experience of being a child lifelong, as we can see it manifest in the indexes of the books that are published. When I first started out researching women in China, there was a joke we used to play, was look in the back of the book and can you see any indexes to women or children or women or gender, and usually there was nothing, like they were just not even index items. And now what I think is even weirder is even in books on gender in China or women in China, if we look for childhood, infancy, babies, girls, boys, they're not even in books written about women, or it's crazy how they're not even considered lexical categories. So that's that I think tells us there's a big gap. Jing Shu's 2024 book on a gender it was an ethnography of Taiwan and a locality in Taiwan, and she said that there's a striking lack of systematic ethnography concerning young children's gendered moral experiences. But I'd add that there's a striking lack of systematic studies in all other fields like history, literature, media. These are all missing this aspect. And where children are explored, gender is often ignored. So given that it's one of our organizing categories, fundamental organizing categories of most societies, we can't really ignore gender, and we should look at it more in relation to children and childhood. So that was kind of the basis of the why I did this talk. But I want to, before I go into a little bit more detail, I wanted to pose a question for Sarah and Ping to think about for the end of the discussion. If someone like Catherine Bernhard had come to you and said, where do you think the gaps are? Where do you think gender in China is going in the future? What would be some of the things that you would say, look, we need to look at this, we need to look at that, because they're either gaps or they're new questions or new inflections on questions that we could really productively learn something from? Because I think in the audience and in the people who listen online afterwards, there probably are some younger scholars who are looking for like new angles to really go in new directions, and to have experts like yourself point out sort of gaps in the field, I think is really helpful. To know where to look for the next topic. Rather than just trying to follow on from what are often models set outside of China. Okay, so I'm hoping you'll have some ideas by the end of the end of the talk. But anyway, if I focus back in on this children and babies and gender, well, it seems to me that children and babies gender the adults around them very, very clearly. We see governments around the world, and particularly in East Asia, trying to solve their low birth rate problem, what they consider to be a problem, the demographic cliff, by focusing on women. They sort of they elevate mothers. They say, oh, motherhood's really important. Being a mother is really, really important. And women become the focus for solving the problem of this demographic cliff. And this is all happening while women's experience in the workplace or in society is that they face discrimination, especially when they become mothers. So you've got one narrative going this way, oh, motherhood's really, really important. But at the same time, the reality of the lived experience of those who are mothers is it's really hard work. It strips away a lot of your autonomy, and you're often disdained for being a mother when you are trying to forge a career. So the celebration and the real impact are not being met by this focus on women becoming mothers. So perhaps we could consider another way of looking at analysing a low birth rate issue by focusing on children and the gendering roles that children play for both men and women. It's across the life course. It's not just a woman's problem. It's actually a whole of the human species issue, if you consider it a problem. And that children are major agents in shaping this society. Men have children too, and often, and if they have a son, it's even seen as a greater aspect of prestige. But it's a boost to their social standing. It's a boost to their career if they have children. And the classic example of evidence of this is you'll often see men in the powerful men in their big offices, and they'll have a photo of their kids and their wife on the desk. You'd never do that if you're a woman who had family, because if someone walks into your office, your status, and sees that photo, your status is instantly stripped down to just a mother or a distracted employee, or, it doesn't add the same kind of cachet to women's lives and careers as it does to men's lives. So the gendered distinction between men and women employees is already stark, but once is already, quite vast and wide. But once children appear, the negative impact of children on women really amplifies discrimination against women. So children gender men and women, adults, in really clear ways. So what if we tried to look at this demographic issue by placing children at the center of our analysis and not women? And then what does that do? What do children do to the gendered lives of adults? We can see another, kind of clear example, which all of us working in China studies know, there's the clear example of the differential value placed on girl babies and boy babies. And that's had dramatic impacts on the gendered adult roles of mothers, fathers, grandma, grandpa, auntie, uncle. And it shows that babies are really powerful in shaping the adults around them. The sex of the baby genders the adult around them, and it's led to with the rates of female infanticide, and has produced this bare stick problem for men who are seeking partners, that they can't find partners. So we know that children are really the core of this, and we need to focus in on them and their gendering roles more if we're to really understand it. It's not just a woman problem. We're not just resistant to motherhood or, wanting to be selfish and careerist. It's actually a much bigger problem, and we should focus on the kids and their experiences as much if we want to understand it. And if we look at acceptable paths to adulthood through the life course, we can also see that children play crucial roles in how adults can perform or be seen to perform acceptable, prestigious, normative adult roles. And one of the things that struck me as I was doing all the research for this was that there's quite strong evidence, contrary to common thinking, I think, that Chinese traditions were not pro-natalist. Chinese families did not want to have lots of kids, in contrast to, say, the Catholic traditions or the Muslim traditions, which today still they see many children as a good thing. Instead, you had a very pragmatic attitude to the numbers of children in families. And there's been some great research on this that I cite in the article, where families were spacing their children carefully because they didn't want the family economy to be wrecked by multiple competing children for scarcer and scarcer resources. So while we sort of tend to think that, everybody in China wants to have lots of kids, I mean, I think that was actually a very common view perpetuated during the one-child family policy. It was like, people aren't allowed to have as many as they want. But actually, a lot of the pro-natalist thinking was something that was projected from the West onto Chinese families, and that historically this has not been a huge driving force. And that's partly an economic thing, but it's also partly a gendering thing. And we can see that the pressure to have sons was much more important than the pressure to have lots of kids, or to have a son at least. And a son really for that family line, for the ancestor worship roles, was important for making a good man. So if you became a really good man once you had that son and you'd done your duty to your ancestral line. For a woman, having the son secured your status in that your husband's family, and made you a potential matriarch of great power within that family, in that uterine family that Marjorie Wolf talked about. But now it's not the case, right? Now we've got women all through China who are having great careers, who are working independently as business people or in public service roles, or in, all sorts of different parts of the economy. And they're really independent. They've got financial autonomy. They've got life choice autonomy. So being a mother is not the only path to acceptable adulthood. You can be a successful adult without being a mother. And if you, by chance, also add that you care as a single or non-parent woman, you care for your parents and grandparents, you are given a lot of virtue credibility. And this is a very valuable role that people are seeing all through China, that daughters looking after the elders is almost makes up for or obviates the kind of criteria of being a mother. That your caring role up the generations rather than down the generations gives you quite a lot of prestige. Being a good child when you are an adult is a really strong female gender role for many women throughout China. You can be virtuous by being a good carer for your elders. But somehow this isn't transferring very much in the same numbers anyway to male adult children. They're able to escape this caring role and aren't sort of punished quite as much for not having caring roles up or down the generations. And often the point is to get a wife who can do your caring roles for you, your caring duties for you. And we know that in rural China in particular, girls are starting to be increasingly valued because they are able to do a lot of the caring roles that are required as part of a human society. Whereas sons are seen as like vehicles for getting that daughter-in-law because the sons won't deliver on those caring roles. So there's a massive impact that caring roles, both as a child and for children, perform as in a gendered sense. And none of these are not new things for us to know about, but it's more that if we take children and the experience of being a child at the center, it might twist the way we see or open new ways of understanding the problems. One of the kind of historical examples that I think I can use to explain this is that in southern China, there was a long tradition of what was translated into English as marriage resistance by female silk workers. So women who worked and could be employed and made lots of money and became very economically important for their families and would resist moving into their husband's house or resist marriage altogether and stay within their financial independence, supporting their natal families. And this was explored and understood as marriage resistance. But I think if we look at it as motherhood resistance, we might see another entirely different aspect to this challenge and this experience, because often the women would marry, but they just wouldn't move into their husbands' houses. And that meant that they were relieved of maternity, pregnancy, giving birth, and the maternal care roles that came with being a mother. And we know this because often these women would buy concubines for their husbands. So they would outsource their reproductive labor. And these women would then still be the main wife, and the concubine would be just the concubine. So all the children that the concubine produced were actually considered to be the main wife's child. So she got that status as a mother without having to do any of the reproductive or caring labor, and she maintained her independence financially and her support for her natal family. So just a slight twist in the way we conceive of it. It's not women resisting marriage, it's women perhaps resisting motherhood, and that this actually has a tradition within China where women become independent. And I don't think it's just China. The other aspect that I think if we look at it as motherhood resistance is important, is that all the reproductive hard work that goes into childbearing is really it's on women's bodies. It's not on men's bodies. And Sarah's brilliant book shows us that through the course of the 20th century in particular, because we see the physical labor of pregnancy. We see the interventions that take place in terms of either nurturing a pregnancy or terminating a pregnancy. These are real imposts on women's bodies. So within that narrative, and with the biomedical model that came through the early 20th century, and Sarah's book shows this really clearly, you can see how the women are weak narrative comes through and is emphasized. And once you get women are weak, then you start seeing another layer of discrimination on adult women. And it's the process of the infants and the producing of the infants, the producing of the babies that causes this weakness. And so what do we see? We see women and children as a socio-political category being promoted through the 20th century. And it's very hard for adult women to be seen as a legible, understandable category of human worthy of government attention or public policy initiative without the "and children" added to it. And I think this is, I mean, I think we should be focusing on children. So while I'm saying, it sounds like I'm saying children are harming women, I'm actually saying we just need to disaggregate and be clearer about the distinction, because in a way, children contaminate the agency and authority of adult women. And so women are staying away from it in larger and larger numbers. Whereas if they didn't contaminate, if women were seen as their own distinct type of valuable human being, then we wouldn't have this, perhaps we wouldn't have as much of a demographic cliff as we do. And, you know, the stripping away of adult women's agency really has lifelong flow-on impacts throughout their careers and throughout their work experience, as well as their, you know, into adulthood throughout. So, you know, it's very, very common in Australia, and I think elsewhere in the Western world, and certainly in China, that as if the women who make it to the top of a lot of really tough professions, they either don't have children, or they aren't married, or they don't have children even if they are married or partnered up. So, for example, Julia Gillard, Australia's first female prime minister, had a partner, but she didn't have kids. And you know, there were some pretty nasty comments made about her, saying she was deliberately barren, you know, that this was held against her and trumpeted through the media. And, you know, she suffered a lot of prejudice in a way that a man would not. And so we see, you know, it's impossible for women to have an autonomous role and when from children, and that is really it hampers women's success, and I think it's not helping children either. I think the other thing, just finally, I want to talk about is the way that children or young people see their parents and the adults around them performing these adult parenting roles. Kids in China know that their mothers sacrificed for them. They also fear that their fathers will be ashamed if they don't get great marks. So they're a threat to the family prestige if they don't perform these roles really, really well. So childhood comes with all these burdens of performing virtue for your parents. And I think a lot of kids, well, they actually don't want to take on those roles. They don't want to be the ones that are then to suffer the way that they've heard their mothers and their fathers suffer on their behalf. And so they're opting out as well. And how can I make this game? Well, I think that there's a lot of hanging on to pre-puberty behaviors among Chinese youth. And we see this through popular culture like J-pop, K-pop, Mandopop, you know, this is Cantopop. And that the stars are seen as, often in public discourse, as being effeminate, female-oriented. But I reckon they're not actually effeminate. They're actually pre-puberty people. They're actually resisting becoming fully hairy, busty, you know, smelly teenagers by stripping back that sort of persona to a pre-puberty human being. And that way they actually, you know, the neutral sex culture is actually, I reckon, pre-puberty culture, and that's what's being celebrated through these K-pop and really embraced by young people through the region. You can avoid responsibility by being pre-puberty. You're still a kid. You can stay good. You don't risk your grades by falling in love, you know, the early love. You don't have to make the transition to adulthood and parenthood. And the longer you delay it, the longer you perform pre-puberty behaviors, you're actually rewarded for it. And I think that we can also see the way that boy love literature plays in that space as well. It's a non-reproductive romance and erotica, and lots of women love this stuff, and lots of young women love this kind of fiction, because you can have all the rush of good feelings of falling in love, and you can vicariously engage in all of that without any risk of reproductive outcomes. So the fear of reproduction and the fear of transitioning to a reproductive adult role is really appealing to young people. And I think that tells us something about the way that gender and childhood and progress through the life course is not just like these K-pop stars are dressing up like girls, you know. There's a crisis in masculinity because they're not looking like real men. I think that's missing the point. I think they're resisting adulthood in really and reproductive adulthood in really significant ways. So I'm running out of time. So I'll just say that's sort of where I was kind of generally exploring without providing any answers and without doing any really great primary research myself. But I was hoping that it might generate discussion and tweak people to think in different ways about the same problems that we are all exploring. Just what, you know, when we first started women's studies, we used to say to people, well, what would this mean if that main character or that historical actor was a woman? Or what would it mean, you know, how would a woman change this situation? How, you know, and so I'm sort of saying, can we do the same with kids? Can we put kids in the frame and really give their experiences and their agency and society some greater highlight? So yeah, that's me.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really fun to listen to. And I think no matter what your background is, I think you can get a lot of interesting stuff from that talk. So really, thank you so much. So we have two invited commentators or discussants. So we'll let I'll introduce each one of them, and they'll have a discussion with Professor Edwards first, and then we'll open up the floor to people in the audience who have questions. So after the second discussant, if you have questions, you can write them in the chat, but we do prefer if you just raise your hand and then actually uh, speak yourself. So, our first discussant is Professor Sarah Rodriguez. She's an associate professor in the Department of Russian and East Asian Languages and Cultures at Emory University. Her research examines the history of medicine and gender and sexuality in modern China. And her current book project is very much related, it seems. Growing Old, A History of Aging in Global China. And it seeks to investigate experiences with aging in the People's Republic of China. So, thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez, for being here. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you so much for inviting me here. I was thrilled to see the topic. It couldn't be more resonate more with what I've been thinking about. And I apologize in advance for any brain fog. I'm deeply middle-aged and it is 9:40 at night. So but I've just had coffee, so I'm going strong. Okay, so Dr. Edwards' scholarship is, in a way, a call for greater intersectionality, specifically with regard to gender and age. And reading the article and listening to the talk, I was really convinced that not only scholars of gender should think about age, and scholars of age should think about gender. But the more kind of interesting innovation here is showing the way that the gender of babies and children themselves not only dictates how they're perceived and treated, but it also influences the social norms and behaviors governing the adults around them. And for me, I found this article to be really interesting and deeply useful because it draws on scholarship in such a wide range of fields. It provides not just like an overview, a state of the field, but it brings in scholarship from history, anthropology, sociology, media studies, medicine, political science, and shows us how if we take seriously gender and age as categories of analysis, we're able to transcend these kind of rigid disciplinary boundaries. So, reading through the article and listening, I came up with a bunch of rather long-winded questions, which you don't have to answer now if you don't want, but I'm just going to put them out into the world since they're on the top of my head. So one important theme that this work highlighted in my mind is the growing malleability of the category of childhood. So it once, as you convincingly argue, it once may have referred generally to the period before puberty or sexual maturity as marked by menstruation or marriage or child rearing. Growing numbers of young people are postponing those milestones either temporarily or permanently. Moreover, as you argue, the popularity of like kawaii culture and cosplay and those sort of things have rendered a kind of childlike innocence and dress more acceptable for adults. So given these changes, would you say that the term childhood still carries, if it ever did, carries a stable meaning? And in your opinion, what ages then are associated with contemporary or with childhood in contemporary China without these clear markers of transition like marriage and childbearing? How do we know when childhood or youth has actually ended? And where does adolescence actually fit into this kind of age spectrum that we're outlining? I really like the way that you analyzed the gendering of young people from so many different vantage points. In the spirit of kind of continuing the innovations that you're making and moving the field of women's studies towards gender studies and beyond, I was wondering if we could extend your analysis beyond gender to think about sexuality even more. So, for example, just as I was reading, I was thinking, oh, it would be interesting to know more about the relationship between children's sexual identities and the gendered expectations ascribed to them. Of course, like on the surface, sexual interest and childhood seem kind of antithetical, but I suspect, and I might be totally off base here, that there's this a growing awareness of different sexual orientations is also changing how children's behavior is perceived. So I wondered how like global LGBTQ activism and various challenges to heteronormativity are impacting the gender norms associated with babies and children. And my final really long question, um, I noticed that the article itself talks in great detail about the Republican era, the late Qing period, and especially the post-Mao era, but less about the Mao era itself. And so I was wondering if we could, if there's time, reflect a little bit about on gender in of children in the Mao era. I was wondering what kind of impact did you think the downplaying of overt gender difference, for example, the popularization of this kind of androgynous Red Guard attire in the Cultural Revolution, and the overall attempted erasure of discourses on sexuality during that period. I wonder what impact those sort of phenomena had on the gendering of babies and children, both in that time period and today, if there is kind of any continuity. So I yeah, I know those are really thick questions, but those are just some of the questions that came to mind. This is such a thought-provoking topic, and like I said, I was just so honored and excited to have the opportunity to think through these sorts of questions with you. So thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to engage with this work.
Do you want me to answer now or wait for Ping? Answer now. Okay.
Whatever you
Well,
want.
this, yeah, this is really interesting. I had not thought about the Mao era as being something distinct, sort of starting from the last question first. But it strikes me as I was, as you were talking, that maybe if we went through all those big, the easiest database of those posters, right? The Cultural Revolution posters and before and beyond. And I seem to have in my head that girls often featured in skirts. that young girls featured in skirts as kind of and I'm just doing this off the top, and maybe if we went through, we'd find that they weren't, but that maybe, I mean, it's possible that female gender was more welcomed in the pre-puberty human during those eras than in the post-puberty era. You know, the life stage of a teenage girl became one of the male suit clothing, but before that, maybe girls got around in skirts. I'm sort of that's it. Might be that there is a significant disjunction in almost a flipping of the gendered norms, that kids became more gendered than the adults around them in terms of their clothing or life roles or things like that. And then the other aspect that I guess I'd respond to in terms of that era is the frequent use of children, but maybe it was both boys and girls, to perform dances for sort of public events. You know, the rolling out of children as representatives of the community. And it still happens today, right? You'll go to you'll visit somewhere in China and they'll bring the local school in to perform dances, and mostly it's girls, but occasionally you'll see boys. And I'm trying to work out whether in the 70s, for example, was it equally boys and girls, or was the dancing and performing role that children performed in manifesting the bright future that is coming, and the care that we need to perform to protect the bright future and reshape a bright future. Because I think children's performances were doing all of that work in a very emotive kind of way. I mean, whenever you see those kids perform, it just like melts your heart, right? You just sort of go, oh, you know. And they really, the affect, they're getting that emotional plug for the propaganda layer that's behind, which is, you know, the bright future, the new world that's coming. And I think that that would be mostly performed by young girls in a way that that maybe was consistent across the Mao era and the post-Mao era and the current era. But again, without, you know, detailed research, I really don't know. And the question before that, the discussion point, I think that there'd be people out in the audience who would know way more than me about this. And I think that's about the possibility for different types of sexualities, you know, different types of human desire. I think this is, you know, the whole trans awareness and bi and non-binary, all of this is certainly impacting schools in Australia, and we see it every day in young people that I interact with just casually. You know, the way they identify as in their gendered sense is so different from what I grew up with. Like, I grew up with like people laughing at girls playing sports and laughing at men playing badly at sports, saying, oh, you're playing like a girl. You know, we just learned to be so ashamed of being female and being locked in this body. And, you know, now people are like experiencing their worlds and their sexuality and their desires in so many different ways. So I think that this will propel another whole way of gendering the adult, that the way that children can gender the adults around them. There'll be people in their 60s like me who, you know, who are going to be saying, well, my granddaughter's come home and said she's bi. What do I do? You know, it's totally transforming their experience of grandparenthood. You know, it's going to be a huge revolution. I think a positive one, because it creates that greater diversity that human society needs to be robust and be able to cope with what's coming up ahead. It's like, you know, genetic diversity is good, and so is, you know, like human gender diversity. I think it's going to be really, really important for keeping us all productive and happy and healthy as a human species. And then the question about childhood and does it have a stable meaning? Yeah, people in childhood studies, they've covered this territory really thoroughly. There was I looked it up while you were talking because I'd forgotten the name. Philippe Ariès wrote a book back in 1960 called Centuries of Childhood, and that one is, you know, really looked at just how malleable this category of childhood is and what it meant and all the different roles that childhood performed. You know, like it wasn't, you know, now we think, oh, child labor was terrible, but, you know, 150 years ago, a child getting a job was a celebrated thing, that different contexts. It meant that you were contributing to your family and you became a sort of grown up, in a way, member of your family by being able to perform those roles. And it wasn't that, oh, children should be able to play forever and ever, totally different meanings ascribed to childhood across history and through and across cultures. And that's where, this sort of topic, if we delve back into Chinese history, we'll find totally different versions of childhood. And one of the projects that me and my PhD supervisor did, we did a small article on Jia Baoyu, Honglomong, and childhood representations in there back in the Tamkang Review. It was maybe 1989. I can't remember what year it was published, but that was what we were looking at there, because Jia Baoyu has an entirely different role as a young boy, but a senior member of the family structure, the family hierarchy. And so the roles that he was performing were entirely different from what we would consider a normal childhood. And so we looked at that kind of project. So definitely, I reckon we could spend a lot of time looking at how childhood has changed over the course of China's history, because we've got so much data in Chinese studies. A lot of places don't have data. Chinese is just like, we've got so much, it's almost a problem. Yeah. But thanks very much, Sarah. That was really interesting. I'll be interested to hear, your answers to your own questions too, and Ping's answers to your questions.
Thank you so much.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. Our next discussant is Professor Ping Zhu. She is professor of Chinese studies at University California, San Diego, and she serves as the editor-in-chief of Chinese Literature and Thought Today. She is the author of Gender and Subjectivities in Early 20th Century Chinese Literature and Culture, and the co-editor of two edited volumes, Maoist Laughter and Feminisms with Chinese Characteristics. She has recently completed a book manuscript titled The Cult of Labor in Modern China. So we're very happy to have you here, Professor Ping Zhu. The screen is yours.
Thank you very much for having me, and it's an honor to be the discussant today for Professor Edwards' talk, along with Professor Rodriguez. Actually, Sarah already asked two questions I wanted to ask, so I'll start with some brief remarks, and probably I'll address some of Sarah's questions in my remark as well. Okay, so I really I regard this as like a manifesto that calls us to intersect childhood studies with gender studies, right? It's a very important piece of scholarship, and in this in the full essay, which is available online for everyone to read, you'll see that Professor Edwards argues that babies and the children are not passive; they are actually active agents in the formation and the performance of gendered identities for everyone, for adults, right? So, in other words, babies gender adults. Babies are gendered and they also gender adults. This is very interesting statement in the first place. And I think it's especially important because the prevalent theoretical frameworks, such as power and subjectivation, right? We use that a lot in our analysis, such as performativity, from Judith Butler, for example, or social reproductive theory by a group of feminists. They all of them have the habit of treating infancy and childhood as kind of pre-gender. So basically means that they kind of exclude children, babies from the analysis, from being the active social agents or gender shaping agents. And children and babies would only be considered when they reach puberty, right? Or when they reach the adulthood. So using the Chinese cases, and from her reading of the Chinese scholarship on gender childhood, taijiao, like fetus education, right? All these ethnographic evidence, we can see that gendered infancy and childhood actually can provincialize our European American paradigm of childhood theory or childhood studies. And also in today's talk, I find something really interesting, which is also in the paper, of course. But for example, we can see that the control of women's reproductive rights actually is more stern or more manifest, more rigorous in the modern and the contemporary period than the pre-modern period, right? So Professor Edwards basically pointed out in her presentation today that the Chinese tradition was not a pro-natalist. Actually, parents in pre-modern China, they had a more agency in determining whether they wanted to stop pregnancy after they have a boy, for example, right? However, today, actually, it's not even today. Ever since the modern period, women's reproductive capacity has been under the regime of the nationalist, collectivist political agenda, right? So, for example, in contemporary China today, this year, women are treated as the natural child bearers, right? Like a lot of Chinese women, they are under the pressure of giving birth to babies and more babies, and it's like being childless almost is stigmatized in China. I think most of you from China should know, like recently a stand-up comedian who joked about she was sick and she joked about, oh, thank God I don't have a husband or kid to take care of, I'm sick. And she was banned, right? As a result of that statement she posted online. So that means the government is really eager to put women on the spot of giving birth to babies, right? Their reproductive labor is basically an imperative in today's China. So that's why I also think this is such a timely intervention to understand what childhood, what pregnancy can do to us right today. And in terms of agency, I think the full paper and today's talk as well actually shows us agency is not what we traditionally understood, like the kind of agency that is autonomous, individualistic. The agency the children have actually, it is more diffused and relational, right? So it's basically agency that situates anyone, any like active actors in the network of sex gender. And in this network, not only adults and the children are agents, but the non-human sometimes are agents. For example, the ability to have a house is important to our reproductive decision. For example, technology is also important, right? So these can be the non-human agents. So I therefore really think this paper, this study pushes us to see this diffused and relational agency in childhood, and we should definitely use it in future childhood studies. And what fascinates me most is the insight that Professor Edwards brings out in the paper. Basically, it's called the East. It wasn't elaborated in the talk, but in the paper, she talked about this demographic cliff, right? Basically, it's about how people in East Asia, especially women, they do not want to have kids anymore, right? Which leads to the cliff, demographic cliff, like the decreasing of population. And so in her paper, she said like these 中性的 neutral gender use and 躺平, like lying flat generation, and this rising rate of childless families, they're not only avoiding adulthood. This was made clear in today's talk as well. They are avoiding parenthood, right? Gendered parenthood, because they want to stay in pre-puberty as long as possible. And this is so true because like parenthood means labor, right? And that labor basically is the majority of the parenthood labor is gendered. It's like women's duty. So that's why it helps to understand why today's urban, especially educated women, they don't want to have kids. Actually, I'm one of them. I made a decision to not have kids a long time ago, and I had to fight my parents about it, of course, but now they accept it. But yeah, I think a generation or even more than one generation of Chinese or East Asian women, they have made that decision to not sacrifice their life or their dreams in this domestic trap, right? Or in this parenthood trap. Okay, so now go to the questions. The first question actually overlaps with Sarah's question. I also wanted to know the socialist period, like how, if this could serve as an outlier in looking at the question of gendered childhood, right? Because in the socialist period, actually, for example, we had this iron girl gender, like this gender idea of iron girl, right? It's like it's like a woman with like strong male masculine traits. And also there was like the red guards mentioned by Sarah, like all these kind of different gendering practices. Also at the same time, for example, there was a public nursery, right? Like, so women could go to social work when they sent their kids to the public nursery. So all these things would like, was there a different gendering experience in terms of childhood during the socialist period? And I was also thinking about this socialist film, 1962 film. It's called The Red Attachment of Women, 红色娘子军, because in that film there was a female protagonist, Hu Chonghua, who became a leader of the army, but she has to like basically give up most of her gendered traits. She doesn't have a lover, she doesn't have a husband, she doesn't have a kid. However, her friend Fu Honglian is married and have kids. It's like a bifurcating path for different gender ideals during the socialist period, right? You can choose to be gender, however, you can also choose to be gender neutral. I wonder whether that actually complicates the observation of the East Asian pattern of gender childhood. And also, I wonder if Professor Edwards can talk about the regional differences and educational level differences that complicates the gender childhood paradigm as well. LGBTQ was also asked by Sarah already, so I was going to mention the movie Wedding Banquet by An Li. In this movie, actually, the gendered parenthood is different, right? Due to the LGBTQ unusual family. And also another question is, I don't know if I'm asking too many questions. Yeah, but feel free to skip some. You don't need to answer all of them. So does the one-child family policy that was active in China for decades, does that change the gender dynamic in this regard? Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Wow, you have such, like, you take it to another whole theoretical level that like, well, that's fantastic. Thanks, P. Again, starting at the most recent question, you know, I reckon that things like same-sex marriage recognition, say in Taiwan, or if it was to come, say, in Hong Kong mainland, was sort of effectively, you know, operating in some places in the mainland, that, and then the connections to surrogacy, whether the surrogacy legislation comes up, then you could see a whole different type of family formation and roles to parenthood emerging. I mean, that brings up a whole lot of other ethical challenges that, you know, I think governments find very, very difficult to manage. But what we might see increasingly is that individuals find solutions for this by asking friends to have babies for them, by, you know, all sorts of other types of reproductive arrangements that are kind of modern versions of the Cantonese silk worker buying a concubine for the husband, so she doesn't have to do the work, the reproductive labor. You know, like, there are so many more possibilities with the new technologies that we have that could transform the way families are formed. Whether we get there, whether in the Chinese case, it could be something that, you know, if the government's genuinely worried about the reproductive cliff, then those are options that need to be considered. Reduce the prejudice on single parenthood, because I know a lot of women in Australia who just gave up trying to wait for the right guy to come along, and they just have the kid on their own, or a couple of kids on their own, and they have, you know, family networks that help support the raising of the kid while they continue on with their careers. So say in China, if you had a child out of wedlock, it's really such a matter of stigma that it makes it, you're carrying such an additional burden, not just the hard work of being a parent, but the role of, the disdained parent, the imperfect parent would be just one bridge too far. So in a way, society's got to come to terms with the fact that, marriages and couples are maybe an old model that we need to get away from if we really want to value children, and if we really want to, have the experience of parenthood in a technologically different world and a morally different world too. Regional differences, and I'm guessing here, but interrupt me. You're meaning regional within China, like different parts of China, different urban, rural, that sort of thing? Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. I think the point that you made at the start about the non-human agents, like I'd never thought of that before, but I think that, and the importance of housing, the importance of some of these other, material foundations, like they are crucial to this whole experience of being able to be a parent, or how you experience the burden of parenthood, whether it be motherhood or fatherhood, because people in rural China aren't having huge numbers of kids either. And a lot of that is financial pressure. Like if you might have women in highly educated urban women who've got plenty of money, and they're going on holiday in Turkey and they're having another holiday in Greece. They've got plenty of money. Money is not the problem. They might even own 2 or 3 flats. Finance is not the problem. It's what it does to their careers. It's what it does to their choices in life, their freedom, their capacities to be individuals and be, what they want to be in their lives. But for rural China, I think there's also the added problem of they actually can't afford it. That unless you can send your kid to work at age 6, which was the early pattern, historically, children were adding to the family labor. Might have been by caring for babies. It might have been by sorting through the grain. Kids had productive work that contributed to the family wealth in a way that we just do not accept anymore in either, Australia or China. And that makes it even harder for families who are on the margins of making it, or getting out of poverty, or just climbing up that ladder, having a better life. Children are not a great option for that. And that's where, there's all that research, which is amazing, on left behind children, on the grandparents that are there in the villages doing that, carrying that burden. Then, they probably enjoy it too. Like I enjoy looking after my granddaughter, but it is a particular role that affects them, but it also changes the child's experience and the parents' capacity to, say, have more children when both of the parents are working in different cities in China. So I'm really looking forward to reading your book about labor, which, do you have a title yet?
The Cult of Labor in Modern
The Cult of Labor.
Yeah.
Because this is really another fundamental aspect, right? Like of choices people make. The Cult of Labor. What a great title. Oh, yeah. Well, I can't wait to read it. And then the first question was about socialist period as an outlier. Wow. Same as Sarah's point. I think that's really a really rich vein for future study, because all those heroines, they had to be Julia Gillard. They had to not be entangled, with family to be that hero. And that sent a message, right? That sent a message to women reading that, to men reading that, like, you to be the hero and to be the fully, revolutionary contributor, don't mess with family. And, that may be the sort of consequences of what we're seeing today, is what is from the consumption of that kind of material. But we'll only know that with really in-depth research. Give up romance to forge revolution, very common pattern for that generation. And we see it in like the diaries. My colleague Pan Wang was writing on the diaries of the Red Guards and things, and that was very much the line, right? We can't have any romantic relationship because we're busy with the revolution. And then you're busy with the revolution for your reproductive years. Well, that means you're not having a lot of kids, are you, at that point? Yeah, so that's, I don't know, do either of you want to answer either of your questions?
Uh, I don't have an answer either because I never looked at the issue of infancy and childhood. But in terms of gender, I do see variance from the paradigm, from the prevalent paradigm, Western, like feminist paradigm. Uh, like in socialist China, I do see the positive, like there were there were more space, we can say, for women to express their gender, not only to the feminine. Like actually, it wasn't even encouraged to for women to express their gender as a feminine role, right? It was expressed, it was encouraged for a woman to express themselves in as a gender neutral or empowered individual, not individual, a collective member. Individual would be the wrong word too, right? So I do see that there was empowered female gender ideal that emerged during the socialist period. However, the market reform in the 80s kind of brought old things back, old tradition back, and people started to complain about the double burden. Like women, they both had to do the domestic labor and social labor. So there was this complaint about women doing too much. They held half the sky, but they were doing too much, right? So that's why the traditional gender ideals were coming back during the post-socialist period, and it was even more traditional or more patriarchal today because of the nationalist, because the nation actually needed women to bring up the population, right? So I see such a tendency, but of course, what I said was like big strokes of history.
Yeah, I would add to that. Oh, I want to, before I forget, the Cult of Labor. What a phenomenal title. And I mean, I'm just so excited for that book to come out.
Thank
Um,
you.
But as to like this question of gender in the socialist period, I think it's really we're kind of painting some very broad strokes. I think we need to kind of subdivide the socialist period a little more carefully. Like even just in my tired brain, the thing that came to mind was like those kind of like socialist realist propaganda posters from the 1950s and 60s. And in my mind, I'm thinking of in the early 1950s, the images of women in these posters are extraordinarily reminiscent of even like the 1920s and 1930s modern girl, like rosy cheeks, white skin. She's almost wearing like a very effeminate, floral, almost dress-like thing, and the children are distinctly gendered. And then you fast forward even just like 4 or 5 years and that image goes away completely. The mom is not even identifiable as a mom necessarily. She's just a person who happens to have a slightly prettier face than the people in the photo who are in the poster who are not supposed to be women. But I feel like there are like some kind of conflicting trends, sort of like when Ping was talking about the bifurcation of gender in these model operas and things. So there's like kind of competing genderings of women and men for that matter, but more specifically women. And I do think that the kind of there has been work on the gendering of children in that period, but I think there's still a lot more room to do things in that period, and then to think about it as it relates to the present, as opposed to just kind of in the socialist vacuum. Um, yeah, so that's just something that sort of came to mind.
Yeah, because we tend to think of that as a sort of like there was a bookmark either end of that period, and as if it had no impact on today. Like
Yeah,
it's like that before and after 49, we forgot that they were the same people
quite
experiencing
literally.
value.
Okay, we have a question already from the audience, so maybe we can let the audience member ask the question. Yeah, so Jong Yoon, you had posted.
Hello. Hi,
Hi.
Sarah. Hi, Louise. So nice
Hi,
to see you online again. Hi.
great to
Thank you
see
so
you.
much. Yeah, Professor Louise Edwards is my PhD advisor, so I'm her
Wow.
student, and it's so lovely to see. And also Sarah is one of my mentors. I can see
We're
can see
buddies.
that.
We're
Right,
buddies.
thank you. It was so nice, and it's inspiring to listen to this talk. Although I've read the paper already, and it's out in Modern China, right? I think my question now, after listening to Professor Drew's questions, I feel like my questions actually is related to all of yours. So probably we can have an open discussion about this. But in particular, I really appreciate the idea that we have to rethink the intersection of gender, age, and childhood, because we know that we probably it's kind of like an accepted idea that children in pre-modern China and or before a certain age, for example, 7 岁or 7 or 8 岁, could be considered as androgynous or asexual. But we now know, especially in the modern, now we look at the 20th century and especially the 21st century, we know that this kind of a relationship is changing. And I have heard about that the social representations and the social media and the social norms all change that kind of a dynamic. But at the same time, I'm also thinking, how about those social infrastructures? For example, especially in the school setting, I actually shared an example because that was just a few weeks ago. I was so surprised to see that my daughter's school report card says that she's a very cheerful and smart girl. So I'm not very comfortable as a gender historian as well. I'm not very comfortable with the idea that she was described as a girl instead of for example, a valued class member, right? But at the same time, they were taught about the ideas that boys and girls are just the same. They can do the same things. You can marry. My daughter came home one day telling me that she wants to marry a girl. And anyways, that's of course that's fine. But you can see there is this discrepancy, like in terms of that infrastructure, how the infrastructure is actually heavily or tied to certain ideas. On the other hand, in practice and the children. So that kind of like discrepancy or in practice, I think also probably would be related to the question that how we think the boundaries between age and gender and sexuality and childhood. Because if I think I've read upon about the idea of childhood in Chinese is 童年, right? But it seems that it's really modern invention. Especially if we look at the historical change about child labor, right? And they can work. They could work even in China too when they were 6. But now, of course, it's legally impossible and it's not allowed. However, then you look at this, so we can still see this kind of like a bit, I wouldn't say that messiness in a contemporary context, but when all of these factors are just coming into the scene, and how should we understand such practices in relation to the historical changes that you've just described, even before the 20th century and up to the two discussants focus on the long 20th century. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm going to dive in. I have a similar anecdote because I've named both my children sort of what were kind of boys' names, and they could be either boys or girls, so Chris and Alex. And my daughter Alex, she came home with a school report that said Alex is a nice boy. He did this, and she was furious because obviously they had gendered templates as well. And she just said, "Does the teacher not even know me? They just slotted the names in, like it's a very powerful thing." And that's where the movement, to use in English anyway, the gender-free pronouns has been quite powerful. The they, I find it really challenging. I'm just like so slow on this, but I think it is actually impacting the way kids experience their gendered roles. And that was like to Sarah's question. And the other bit about age, which we didn't take up very, Sarah's point about age and gender, I think is also something that's worth looking at, because aging is a huge issue, right? And we now will have a whole generation of men who are older men who require caring, and who will they care that have to receive care? Who will they receive care from? How will they respond to the care giving when they have no experience of caring for someone else as well? I don't know. I think there's sort of like different ways people will receive care as an older person by their children or by their daughters-in-law or by, like I know, because older men, they have their dignity too. And if women are doing all of the caring, maybe they don't want to be bathed by a woman. Maybe they'd like their son to perform that role. Maybe they don't want the daughter-in-law. So all these kind of like, we assume that old people are as asexual as children, and that is not the case either. So yeah, I mean, those are just my two little bits in there, but open to the others, I think is.
To your point, Louise, about I feel like that's what's super rich. I mean, in and of itself, it's a really rich topic, but like the applicability of your kind of interventions to lots of different things. Like I can see how thinking about age and gender and infancy applies to my own thinking about nursing homes, my own research on nursing homes, um, or to this kind of question of gender. I was doing some like oral histories with kind of retirees or senior citizens or what have you, and I asked one guy, when does old age begin? And he said, when I stop being able to fuck younger women. And I said, oh, okay. um, that's a very deeply gendered, but I think it's a quite a telling comment, right? Like, where does asexuality end and begin? Where does childhood end and begin? When your kind of fertile period end and begin? And what does that mean in our understandings of like gendered experiences?
Yeah, because for women, it's quite marked. We know when menopause hits, we're no longer bleeding monthly. It's pretty clear that there's that marker for our physical life. I don't think it happens for men, but obviously this guy had a very clear idea about his pulling power or his power to get younger women was the marker for him. And that when that goes, then that's it. Wow. I'm amazed.
We had this conversation in a public library. I was blushing heavily.
Can I ask you guys if you got any answers to like if you'd been asked by Catherine to say what are some gaps in the field of gender that you'd like to see addressed? Do you have any like way of how would you have responded? I mean, because I've been like following Yun's work on the, reproductive history and stuff. So I was kind of keen to see something happen on children. But what would there be other things that you would recommend younger people or new people looking for a new topic?
That's a very good question, and it caught me because I don't have a ready answer, but I think actually we talked about asexuality just now, right? I feel like to some extent asexuality probably would be a more popular trend than it is today because our culture, mass culture, basically gives too many or excessive outlets for our pleasures to for our pleasurable enjoyment. So like in a way our desire is being watered down in our daily, for example, into internet consumption, right? Or watching movie, going to concerts. So there are a lot of ways that consumes human energy. So that's why there was this book called Low Desire Society to describe Japanese culture, right? I feel like low desire is coming to China as well, right? Like people feel like they don't want anything, they don't want to date. Actually, this is a new trend, right? They don't want to date, or they don't want to have a stable boyfriend, girlfriend. They don't want romance because it's too energy consuming. So eventually, maybe the asexual pattern would be the new gender pattern. Oh, we need a asexual gender, right? Maybe. But on the other hand, I do think technology would change the dynamics of gender as well, right? And of course, age, childhood, these would all be changed by technology. We probably would have robots, nannies, right? In the households very soon. So the mothers do not have to do the gender labor like they were doing before. So I think this might happen very soon, actually. So and the motherhood itself might be changed, like surrogate womb or something like that. Actually, people already use surrogate motherhood, right? The rich people can afford that. But in the future, maybe technology can take over the motherhood, the pregnancy burden from women. But these are just like sci-fi imagination. I don't know when this would happen.
That's a much more interesting answer than mine, and that I think creates a lot of food for thought and interesting directions that this ever-growing field can go in. My thought is always so like I teach a class on gender and sexuality in modern China at Emory, and I think that this is not to say that this field is not already growing, but I feel that students have this real burning desire to talk more about queerness in a very capacious manner, including, asexuality, transness, every kind of different permutation of sexuality. And that's a thing that I think is so exciting, that the kind of things that maybe were satisfying or really pioneering in the 90s and 2000s are now like ho hum, oh, a gender binary, how boring. And now I don't know, I think students just think much more capaciously about these topics, and I think that that's really exciting. And for example, I went to a conference recently and on aging and family, and somebody was presenting on like trans and queer senior citizens, and I was like, that is such a great topic. Like those are the kinds of really interesting and intersectional topics that I don't know if those would have been possible to address, a few decades ago. So I see that as being like really that and like all of this kind of sci-fi non-human actor things that Ping raised. I think those are kind of like the next frontiers for this growing field.
Oh, that's great. Paul, I can looking at the clock here, and I just want to spend a couple of minutes on the sadder note to say that before I thank everybody for the great discussion, but then the sadder note to say that today is the funeral for Anne McLaren, one of the leaders in our field. She worked on women's performance culture, oral culture through the from the Ming onwards, and she was Melbourne University academic, was instrumental in keeping many of us going. She was, yeah, really an important figure for us. And then just this morning, I heard that Harriet Zerndorfer had passed away, and this was certainly something totally unexpected. And she created the journal Nanu and 25 years ago, and she's been like driving this space and keeping it going, bringing men and women and gender into the same conversation, and it's just really, really sad. So I hope everyone has a couple of thoughts for those two amazing women scholars that we've just lost in the last month. And yeah, but also now, can I just say thank you so much, Paul and Ping and Sarah, for such an engaging conversation. I really appreciate the time that we've had together to share ideas, and so good to see you, Yun.
Thank you. Thank you. So nice to see everybody.
Yeah, well, thank you everyone. I think this has been a really great event, and like Ping mentioned before, this was kind of reminiscent of an event we had a couple years ago, and I hope we can have a similar one. I messaged both Sarah and Ping about their books, and I said, if you guys, when your books come out, if you want to have a book discussion, maybe with some of the people here, that would be, I think, fantastic. So thank you, everyone. And for anyone who's interested, tomorrow around the same time, we have a talk on Buddhism and AI. So that's by Peter Hershock. I don't know if people know him, but he's a fantastic scholar. Like Louise, he has these very well thought out ideas that he somehow makes very clear and easy to understand. So this will be also, I think, a very nice talk. So yeah, thank